This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society. In Module 2, we are examining how writing represents language. We now turn to the Chinese writing system, which corresponds to the content in Section 3.1 of the textbook, Language, Technology, and Society, by Richard Sproat. In this video, we are going to examine the Chinese writing system and specifically look at the question of how Chinese writing encodes language. The learning objective for this video is to identify what linguistic information is encoded in the Chinese writing system. By the end of this video, you should be able to succinctly answer this question. You should be able to go through the types of Chinese characters and identify what type of linguistic information is encoded in each type of character. The Chinese writing system can be described as a hybrid system. That is, a logosyllabary. A logography is a system that encodes morphemes. A syllabary is a system that encodes syllables. The Chinese writing system has aspects of both of these types of writing systems. The Chinese writing system contains aspects of a logography. In the Chinese writing system, each symbol represents one morpheme. In a pure logography, each symbol would only represent a morpheme and would not include any information about the sounds. However, Chinese symbols often contain information about the syllable and how it's pronounced, in addition to encoding the morpheme. In Chinese, it happens to be the case that each morpheme corresponds to exactly one syllable. As such, we can say that the Chinese writing system contains aspects of a syllabary, in that each symbol represents a syllable. Now, the Chinese writing system is different from many other syllabaries, but it does still have the aspect that each Chinese symbol corresponds with a syllable. Chinese writing system is sometimes described as an ideography. This is misleading in that an ideography has symbols that directly represent ideas. It has been well argued that Chinese writing system is not, in fact, an ideography. As we will see, the Chinese symbols each represent a morpheme, and in many cases represent sound information as well. However, there are a few symbols, specifically two types of symbols, that may be considered partially ideographic. We'll look in this in more detail. So, to summarize, the Chinese writing system is a logosyllabary. It contains aspects of a logography. Each symbol represents one morpheme, and each morpheme happens to correspond to one syllable. Because of that, the Chinese writing system contains aspects of a syllabary because each symbol also happens to correspond to a syllable. The Chinese writing system contains aspects of an ideography because a few symbols may be construed as being partially ideographic. Now let's look in detail at the 6 different types of Chinese characters. These types are described in section 3.1 of our textbook, Language, Technology, and Society. These types, this list of 6 types, also is based on historical Chinese linguistic accounts. Type 1 are the simplest type of Chinese characters. These are characters that are derived very directly from simple pictograms. Simple pictograms were early predecessors to Chinese writing that then evolved into symbols such as what we see here, the symbol for person. Another example of a simple pictogram is the symbol for tree. This one is a little easier for me to see. So early versions of this would have been pictograms that more directly represented a tree. And it's not too hard to see that this character is a stylized version of a tree. The second type of Chinese character are called indicators. Similar to simple pictograms, indicators are simple characters, but whereas simple pictograms depict concrete objects like person or tree that can be concretely represented as a pictogram, the concepts depicted by the indicator characters are more abstract. Here we have the symbol for up. So you can imagine this vertical line extending upward as an abstract representation of the concept up, that then this symbol represents the morpheme for up. Similarly, here's the morpheme for middle. This morpheme is found in many important Chinese words, including the word for the Chinese language. Here is the corresponding indicator character for the morpheme down. Type 1 characters, which are simple pictograms, and type 2 characters, which are indicators representing more abstract concepts, are both directly logographic in nature. These symbols directly represent morphemes, one character for one morpheme. Now, it happens that these morphemes each also represent exactly one syllable. But the sound information is not directly encoded in the symbol. You have to know that the symbol is pronounced a certain way. These characters are not ideographic. The Chinese character representing the morpheme for person does not correspond to the abstract concept of person. Rather, it's representing the particular Chinese morpheme ren. Similarly with the other morphemes you see here. The third type of Chinese character represent meaning compounds or semantic compounds. So on the right, we see here a character that is compound in nature. This is the first one that we've seen so far. So the 5 characters that we've looked at so far have each been single symbols. Here, 2 symbols are combined in abbreviated form to form a single compound character. This character represents the Chinese morpheme meaning grove. Let's look at how this character was composed. We saw a moment ago the Chinese morpheme with the character for tree. In the character that we're examining now, the compound character, we have this symbol tree twice. The compound character has these individual characters squished horizontally somewhat, but they're both still noticeably the tree character. So, there's clearly a semantic relationship here between the component characters, tree, and the concept grove. Conceptually, a grove is a small stand of trees. So, if we have 2 tree characters, those go together to form the grove character. Another example is the Chinese character for military. The first character that we see in the composite character represents an ancient Chinese weapon that can sometimes be translated as dagger axe. When combined with the morpheme for foot, we have this morpheme representing a particular kind of weapon with the morpheme for foot. We end up with the morpheme for military. Again, this has semantic compounding going on. So the meaning of the individual characters is put together to form a related concept, military. This is clearly logographic in nature. The symbol for military represents a morpheme, the Chinese morpheme wu. For those Chinese speakers among the audience, please accept my apologies for my absolutely horrendous pronunciation. I've never learned to pronounce tones. Now, we could think here that there's something approaching an ideographic approach here. So there's clearly semantic compounding going on, and to the extent that that compounding takes 2 ideas and combines them together in something that's sort of compositional, we're approaching something ideographic in nature in these type 3 meaning compounds. So the type 3 meaning compounds are the closest that we're going to get to an ideographic representation in Chinese. However, the type 3 characters are relatively rare, and it has been argued that no ancient Chinese characters were of this type. So, we've got type 3 characters that are the closest to ideographic. They're relatively rare. There's a good argument that there's no ancient characters, and it is believed that these are not productive in modern Chinese, meaning no more type 3 characters are being actively generated. That contrasts very strongly with type 4 characters, phonetic compounds. Phonetic compounds are very, very common in modern Chinese and have been productive for centuries. We see here on the right a compound character that has 2 individual characters that compose it. Let's now take a look at those individual characters. The first character is one that we've seen before, the character for tree. The second character of this composed compound character is the morpheme for elephant, pronounced zhang. So, those two characters are put together to form this composite character, which also happens to be pronounced zhang. Now, there's clearly a logographic component. Each of the individual components, the morpheme for tree and the morpheme for elephant, represent individual morphemes. The composite character also represents a morpheme. Thus, it is logographic in nature. But there's also a phonographic component. Here's our first example of a compound Chinese character that part of the character tells you how the character, the composite compound character, is pronounced. So, the character for elephant is the aspect of the composite character that carries the pronunciation, the phonographic component. So, when a Chinese speaker looks at this character, even if they've never seen it before, if they know the character for tree and they know the word and character for elephant, then it's not too hard to work through the process. This character likely has a meaning having to do with some kind of tree that is pronounced the same way you would pronounce the word for elephant in Chinese. So, we've got a logographic component and a phonographic component. This type of character is very, very common. The vast majority of Chinese characters are of this type. There's a logographic component and a phonographic component. However, even though this type of Chinese character is extremely common, it's not always obvious that a particular composite Chinese character is a phonetic compound. That's because the phonographic component isn't always obvious. Let's take a look at an example of a type 4 Chinese character that is a phonetic compound that the phonographic component is far from obvious. So, here on the right, we have a composite character. It's got two component characters, one of which carries some phonographic information, but that's not necessarily obvious to a modern Chinese speaker. So the first component is the character for turtle shell. Now, this is the character that's carrying some of the phonographic information. But we will see that unlike the characters for oak and elephant, which were pronounced exactly the same, here the composite character is pronounced kinda, sorta like the character for turtle shell, but not nearly exactly. So we've got the character for turtle shell, and we've got the character for bird. So the bird is going to carry some of the semantic content of the composite character. So we've got turtle shell, bird, and the composite means duck. So the composite is a type of bird. A duck is a type of bird. And the character, the symbol, the pronunciation for duck sounds sort of like the word for turtle shell. What's going on here? Well, it can be presumed that there's some sort of archaic pronunciation that's involved in some way here, in that either the word for the pronunciation for turtle shell has changed, or the pronunciation for duck has changed, or both over the course of centuries. So this sort of thing happens all the time across human languages. let's look at an example of the exact same thing or something very similar happening in English, where pronunciation changes over time so that the surface form of the word, when you look at it, no longer matches how you would think it would be pronounced. So the example here is the English word night, spelled K-N-I-G-H-T. Now, looking at this is not transparent. So a transparently spelled word is one where when you look at the spelling, that tells you exactly how it's pronounced. This is not the case here. So the modern English pronunciation for this word is night. So we've got a consonant, n, a diphthong vowel, I, and a consonant, t, n-I-t. But the orthographic form has a K in it, and it also has a GH in it. Now, in most English words, if there's a K, we would expect that K to be pronounced with a K sound. And the GH is a bit weird because GH occurs in quite a few English words, but it's almost always silent. So why is it there? Well, it turns out that the archaic pronunciation from Middle English is knicht. So the old pronunciation that would have been pronounced in England for this word with this spelling hundreds of years ago has a pretty much one-to-one mapping between how it's spelled and how it's pronounced. So in the old pronunciation, the K was indeed pronounced K. The N was pronounced N. The I was pronounced I, or E. The GH was pronounced. It had a H sound that corresponds to the IPA symbol X. And the T was pronounced T. So we got the pronunciation knicht. And knicht eventually changed over time to night. And it's presumed that something quite similar here was happening with the word for turtle shell or the word for duck or both. And this is very common. There's lots of Chinese compound characters that, if you look deeply into the history, originally were formed through phonetic compounding. So in phonetic compounding, we generally have one of the characters that's providing phonographic information and one of the characters that's providing semantic information. So this can sometimes be called a phonetic semantic compound. This brings us to type 5 characters. So type 5 characters are a bit harder to explain. They're not terribly well understood, and there's not very many of them. So here is an example that was provided by the textbook author, by Richard Sprout, in Chapter 3, in Section 3.1, describing the Chinese writing system. Sprout provides us with the Chinese symbol for trust. And we see here that this compound character is made up of a stylized version of the character for person and a compacted version of the character for speech, meaning trust. So what's going on here? Well, the resulting character, the compound character, is clearly still logographic in nature, in that the character for trust represents a morpheme, the Chinese morpheme for trust. It could be argued that something somewhat ideographic in nature is happening here, similar to what we saw in the meaning compounds in the type 3 characters. So there's possibly something compositionally ideographic going on here, but the type 5 characters are not well described. They're relatively poorly understood with respect to the other 5 types of characters, and they're quite rare. So this brings us to the final type of Chinese characters, type 6. So we've got In type 6, something that's called by Richard Sproat phonetic borrowing. Other authors use other terms, for example, redirected. So, the example that we have here starts with the archaic symbol for grain. The modern Chinese character for grain is different from what we see here. But at one point, this character was used for the Chinese symbol and word for grain, pronounced something like lai. Again, forgive my terrible Chinese pronunciation. Now, this character, over time, became used to mean something completely different, but with exactly the same pronunciation. So this came to be the morpheme to come, so the verb to come. So this is purely phonographic. And it's fairly obvious what's going on here. This is a clear application of the Rebus principle. So the symbol for grain with the pronunciation for the word grain was used to mean something else. So this goes back to our earlier discussions of the Rebus principle. For example, with the pictographic representation of an I being used for the English pronoun I, or an emoji for can being used to represent the verb can. So a clear application of the Rebus principle. So let's review what we've gone through. We've got 6 different types of Chinese characters. While it's been claimed by many different people over hundreds of years that the Chinese writing system is purely ideographic in nature, we've established here that that is simply not the case. Now, there are a few Chinese characters that something is going on that is somewhat ideographic in nature. But in general, every single Chinese character is clearly logographic in nature. And the vast majority of Chinese characters are phonetic compounds, meaning that the vast majority of Chinese characters also provide phonographic information. Let's review each of these types. So, simple pictograms are purely logographic in nature. For example, the simple pictogram tree. This character derived historically from a pictorial representation of a tree that evolved into a stylized character that we see here. Indicator characters are the second type of Chinese characters. These, like type 1, are purely logographic. Here, instead of representing a concrete concept like a tree or a person, we have a more abstract concept being represented. So we've got a character here that represents the morpheme, not the concept, up. Third, we have type 3, which are meaning compounds. Meaning compounds take 2 characters, or potentially more than 2, and combine them into a compound character. So this type of compound character is very, very common in Chinese. Compounding, that is. Meaning compounds, on the other hand, where this sort of semantic compounding takes place, such as what we have here, where 2 characters, the character for tree used twice, represents a grove, where there's a semantic relationship between the individual characters that compose the composite character and the meaning of the composite character itself. So a grove is made up of trees. So there's something sort of ideographic going on here, but this is relatively rare. And even though something a little bit ideographic is taking place, it's still logographic in that this character, this compound character that's formed through semantic compounding, still represents a morpheme, which is, after all, what logographic means. Finally, we come to the most common, the fourth type of character, which is phonetic compounds. The vast majority of Chinese characters, even historically, are of this form. So this type of character is very, very common. And this type of character is logographic in that it represents a Chinese morpheme, and also phonographic in that part of the character, one of the components, presents phonographic information. So it tells the reader how to pronounce the character. Now, we've seen that not all phonetic compounds have obvious pronunciations, and this goes back to potentially archaic pronunciations. So language changes over time, pronunciations change over time, and so just as with the English word night no longer being pronounced knicht, we have many Chinese phonetic compounds that have information that was phonographic in nature that no longer directly corresponds with its modern pronunciation. The fifth character is very, very rare, the fifth character type. This is the redirected character type, such as what we see in the morpheme for trust. Again, it could be argued that something somewhat idiographic in nature is happening here, but this is very rare, and even so, this is still primarily logographic in nature. Finally, we have direct phonetic borrowings, where a direct application of the Rebus principle was used to create the character in its secondary form. So here we have an example, the character meaning to come, that was derived from an ancient usage of the same character with a different meaning, where the Rebus principle was used to give the character a new meaning. So here we've got logographic aspects and a very strong phonographic component through the application of the Rebus principle. That concludes the 6 types of Chinese characters. So in going through this list, we can see that all 6 types convey logographic information. Simple pictograms are logographic, indicators are logographic, meaning compounds are logographic, phonetic compounds are logographic, redirected characters are logographic, and phonetic borrowings are logographic. Now, it's also the case that every single one of these 6 types of characters also convey a syllable. Now, this is because Chinese morphemes happen to always be single syllables. So each simple pictogram represents a syllable, each indicator represents a syllable, each meaning compound represents a syllable, each phonetic compound represents a syllable, each redirected character represents a syllable, and each phonetic borrowing represents a syllable. Now, some of the Chinese character types explicitly carry phonographic information. That is not the case for simple pictograms. Simple pictograms do not tell you how the character is pronounced. Indicators do not tell you how the character is pronounced. And meaning compounds do not tell you how the characters are pronounced. However, the most common type of character is phonetic compounds, and phonetic compounds do tell you how to pronounce the compound character. So phonetic compounds are phonographic in nature because one of the components that make up the compound character provides phonographic information about how the compound character, is pronounced. Redirected characters do not provide phonographic information. However, phonetic borrowings very clearly do. This is the most obvious application that we see in Chinese of the Rebus principle in action. So here we've got the phonographic component very obviously seen. Now, a small number of Chinese characters have have what could potentially be argued to be ideographic information. This is not a slam dunk, but it is somewhat ideographic in nature. So this is not the case with simple pictograms. Simple pictograms are very clearly not ideographic. Indicators are very clearly not ideographic. Meaning compounds could be argued to be somewhat ideographic in that they are compositionally semantically compositional. Phonetic compounds, which are again the most common character type, are also very clearly not ideographic in nature, although one of the characters usually carries semantic information. Redirected characters can be thought of as maybe having a little bit of ideographic information, again in the same way that meaning compounds do. But phonetic borrowings don't have that. So all of these character types are logographic. Some of them are phonographic, and occasionally we see some ideographic information, but that's rare. So we've now gone through and learned how the Chinese writing system encodes language. Chinese and the Chinese writing system is a logosyllabary. It contains aspects of a logography in that each symbol represents one morpheme. We're not calling it a logography in the classic sense, although some people might. The reason that we're not using that term here is that we're following the argument that Richard Sproat makes in the textbook, and that argument is a logography, a pure logography, would convey only information about morphemes and would not also contain phonographic information. Now, in Chinese, because each Chinese morpheme corresponds to a syllable, it can be said that the Chinese writing system contains aspects of a syllabary in that each symbol represents a syllable. And we've seen that the Chinese writing system contains a few or occasional aspects of an ideography, in that a few symbols can be thought of as being partially ideographic in nature. So, this is how the Chinese writing system encodes language. It encodes the Chinese writing system encodes the Chinese language by encoding morphemes, where each morpheme also happens to correspond to a syllable, and where some of the symbols contain a little bit of ideographic information, or so it can be argued, but very, very, very many of them contain phonographic information. So the vast majority of Chinese characters carry phonographic information because they are phonetic compounds, and all of them correspond to morphemes.